I'm Fran Notarianni. I'm a member of Kleinbard's Litigation department, and part of my practice area includes election law, litigation involving government officials, government entities, and constitutional matters. And this here is my colleague, Shohin Vance.
Thanks, Fran. I'm Shohin Vance, and I'm a partner here in Kleinbard's Litigation department. My practice focus is much like Fran's, political law and election law matters. During my time here at Kleinbard, we've handled a number of high-profile cases, including high-profile election matters that have ended up in the various courts in Pennsylvania.
And we're coming out of a primary election and into a general election, so we're starting to get a lot of questions on what to expect this November. Shohin, can you tell us what to expect?
Well, I think the one thing that you can expect, and that's really common every year, is that you're going to have 67 different mini elections in Pennsylvania, and that's because you have 67 different counties, each of whom have their own procedures and practices in place for handling certain types of issues that come up. And so what that leads to is a patchwork of different rules that candidates and voter groups and campaigns need to be aware of and understand.
You mentioned patchwork. What are some common issues that arise just by nature of there being 67 different mini elections?
This can affect a number of different aspects of election administration, but in particular, two come to mind. One is the area of mail-in ballots. So you may have certain counties that allow drop boxes, certain counties that don't. Also, different counties treat different defects on mail-in ballots differently, whether it's a lack of a signature or a secrecy envelope or whatever the case may be.
Or the lack of a date?
Or lack of a date, an issue that we have litigated successfully several times in the past. Second issue that comes up has to do with provisional ballots, which is something that we've also successfully litigated here at Kleinbard. But different counties, again, handle those things differently, and it's important to be aware of that and understand that going into the election.
And can you explain a little bit about provisional ballots, what they are, and what kind of issues arise relating to them specifically?
Yeah, so a provisional ballot is a ballot that is issued to a voter on election day whose eligibility to vote cannot be verified at the polling location. This may be because they don't have the identification that they need because they're a first-time voter. It can also happen because their name simply isn't in the poll book or the voter registry. And in that case, a voter is issued a provisional ballot, which they fill out, and that ballot is counted separately, and it's only counted if the identity and eligibility of the voter can be verified after the election at the County Board of Elections. And provisional ballots may not get as much attention as mail-in ballots do, but they certainly can make the difference in an election. In 2020, for example, there were over 100,000 provisional ballots cast in Pennsylvania.
You're right, and when candidates and campaigns are thinking about provisional ballots, that typically means the election's close and they care how they're counted or if they're counted at all. Can you walk us through some other issues relating to close elections, like, for example, a recount?
You hear a lot about recounts, but the reality is recounts usually will change the final count, but they will only change the final count by a handful of votes. Unless it is a very, very close attention, a recount is really unlikely to make a difference. And it's also important to remember that even though there is a mandatory recount provision in for state offices where the result is within 0.5%, there is no similar requirement for any other office. So if you're a candidate for Congress or state legislature or what have you, if you want to recount, you need to follow the very detailed and arduous process that is set out in the election code. And I can tell you it can be very difficult to execute if you don't have a plan in place beforehand.
Can you elaborate a little bit on why it's so difficult?
Well, so if you want a recount, for example, in a state legislative race, you need to file hundreds of different recount petitions simultaneously, and you need to get hundreds of different voters lined up from every area of your district to sign on to a recount petition. And that can be a very tall order if you have not thought about this before the election. I've received calls sometimes from candidates who are in a very close race, and they want to know the process for a recount. But if the deadline is in 2 days, you're not going to be able to execute that strategy in time. You simply don't have the time to get everything you need in line to do it.
Other than recounts, what are some other issues that might arise this November?
So I think third-party ballot access is something that has been an issue in the last few elections and will likely continue to be an issue. We litigated a third-party ballot access case in the Supreme Court last year, but as the courts have started to reduce the requirements for third-party candidates and independents to access the ballot, you've seen more litigation on what exactly those requirements are and the strictures surrounding those requirements.
Looking ahead, what about some issues that might arise even beyond this November?
I think one issue that could come up before the census in 2030 is actually redistricting. And that could come up specifically in two different forms. First, something called prisoner gerrymandering, which has to do with where the prison population is allocated for purposes of determining district size. That type of litigation could end up requiring congressional districts to be redrawn. The second thing that could come up has to do with coalition and majority-minority districts under the Federal Voting Rights Act. The law continues to be unsettled, and there's a lot of open questions on whether coalition districts are required or even permitted under federal statute.
Those are two really interesting points that we'll keep our eye on as we move forward. It sounds like the takeaway from all this is that this litigation moves quickly, it's complicated, and because of the fact that there are 67 different counties administering their elections differently, you have to be keyed in to what's going on in each of those counties.
Yeah, and with the speed at which these things move and the various moving parts involved and the different strategies that you have to have in place early on and you have to be able to execute quickly, it's important to have trusted counsel by your side early on, because that can make the difference between winning and losing in November.